Hello. Hi. My name is Andre Mamola. I'm president of the Law and History Society, and this is the first in a series of lectures on the new history of international law. We are fortunate to have with us today one of the pioneers of this field, Professor Samuel Moyn. What we're trying to do with this lecture series is to bring a lot of speakers onto campus who have been sort of reviving this field and breathing new life into it. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Moyn here, who has written many books on intellectual history. He will have a new one coming out from Harvard University Press on Last Utopia, A History of Human Rights. And I think that we're all going to get a lot from listening to his views. He has a lot to offer. His books have won numerous prizes. And without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Samuel Moyn.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I am a professional historian. I did go to law school, but that was years ago. And in a place like this, I'm a stranger in a strange land. And I hope you'll remind me of that fact in the questions. I was really gratified to get this invitation to speak, to introduce a series that Andre is organizing on the new history of international law. Now, when he invited me, my first response was, yes, but what is it? But I think he's actually right. The fact is that professional historians of my kind were, until recently, not very interested in international law as a historical factor in modern societies. And so for professional historians, what's new about the history of international law is that historians are doing it at all. Now, in my own field, the history of human rights, actually, history as a discipline is one of the last to enter the field of human rights. Political science and law were, of course, pioneering. But it's only in the late 1990s, when human rights were close to becoming a kind of millennial creed in the American public sphere, that historians began to think about what the history of human rights was, where they came from. If you look at the main journal, the sort of equivalent of the Harvard or Yale law journals in the historical field, there's the first article that mentions human rights in the title comes from 1998. And the first mention of the Universal Declaration of 1948 in its pages is also in 1998, telling us that something has happened in the 90s. Now, with the rise of the recent administration, Americans care about human rights in a new way, not as an export, but as something that might matter to restrain more local politicians. But in any case, in the 90s and 2000s in the United States, human rights matter in a new way. Now, you'll have, I think, in this series, a kind of a star-studded cast of people who look at the origins of international law. I'm going to be looking more recently and on the American scene, actually. I'm going to really be talking in a much broader sense about the history of human rights. And if there's time, I'll turn in a last bit to think about how we think about the place of international law in particular in the broader history of human rights. I think it matters to law schools that Andre has organized this series. After all, law schools remain basically trade schools, and this affects the kinds of intellectual life they cultivate, I think, very deep ways. Until recently, law schools didn't provide much of a home for professional historical scholarship. Now they make room for American historians studying U.S. history. But by and large, the history of old Europe, as it used to be called recently, which is, after all, where international law got its start, still remains the province of other parts of the university. But as I say, I'm going to be talking about recent history and about American history mostly. So I'm a bit more on your home turf. Even so, I hope to show you that the recent past could be a pretty foreign country. So let me start with my first big step, and it may take up most of my time, or all of it, which is to think more broadly about how human rights as an idea came to the world. What are some models for thinking about where it came from. What I want to ask is that even if we believe fervently in human rights, we detach from them for a moment and step back and ask why we do. Now, we might address that question from lots of perspectives. There's a psychological perspective because it's something that evokes a kind of emotion in those who commit to the idea. Or a philosophical perspective that asks, well, how are they grounded or where are they grounded? But as a historian, I want to ask, where did they came from? When did people in large numbers start to accept them as the idealism or utopia they hope to advance in the world? And what I want to suggest is that is pretty recently. And then if I have time, I'll look again at American international lawyers in particular and how they might fit in the story I want to suggest, or a particular model of the history of human rights I want to suggest. Now, even though it's new, the history of human rights, I think, is typically thought about also in public discussion according to what I want to call a church history model. Now let me spell out that analogy because it's really important because it's what I want to argue against and replace. What do I mean when I say it's tempting to think about human rights as a kind of church history? Well, in Christian church history, which used to be written, how do historians treat Christianity? It's not an accidental idea, and it's not an idea that makes its way in the world on accident. Instead, they think about Christianity as the one true belief. And if it emerges, it does so because it's true and valid. And if it succeeds, it does so for the same reason. And I think roughly, that most people think about the history of human rights, including professional historians, in just this way. Now, of course, Christians knew that they were a new thing. Jesus was bringing good news, and there had been lots of people before them. But how did they think about that past? Well, history was, in a sense, on hold. You'll remember in Dante's Inferno, there's a whole part of hell for people who just had the bad luck to be born before Jesus. Now, there's also a past that church history does something different with, and that's the past of the Jews. How did the church historian think about Jews? Well, they were blindly anticipating something else. They may have thought they were trying to be Jewish and perpetuate the Jewish religion, but in fact their historical role was to bring about something later and be left behind by that something. Then once Jesus comes about, the church historian proceeds by giving a tale of apostles, saints, and martyrs. They may have to die for the one true faith, and we remember them for doing so. But if the religion succeeded, it's because they promoted the cause in a world of suffering and evil. Now, basically, human rights historians tend to tell the history of human rights this way. Someone comes up with the idea, and then a very few people, a kind of early church, stick with it against enormous opposition. But just like the early church, this idea is destined to go far. So this tends to be the way I'd suggest even professional historians think about where human rights came from. The story is teleological. It's going somewhere. It's leading to us. And it's triumphalist. It's about the coming of good news to the world. Now, what's wrong with that way of thinking about history in general and the history of human rights in particular? Well, I think a few things. First of all, it leaves a lot out, what doesn't fit the story. Let me just give one small example for now. Internationalism as an idea, as a movement even, is considerably older than human rights. It really comes about in the 19th century. And that's the moment when international law professionalizes, becomes something that people do for a living. The principal early journals are founded then, and eventually even Americans found a journal in the early part of the 20th century. But international law and internationalism more generally doesn't understand itself to be given the mission of propagating rights. Something else has to happen. And that tends to get left out of the story, where international law is seen as having a kind of role eventually in the history of human rights. It might have been pointing in different directions. Now, the larger point you might draw from my criticism of this church history model is, I think, more important. And it really comes down to this. The history of the values and idealism in modern times that people might have reason to back and to try to advance was one of very deep competition. Human rights didn't exist for the longest time. There were other games in town, including when it came to ideas that might have a kind of internationalist or globalist kind of bearing. And so if we think about human rights that way, we start to think not in terms of church history, a kind of struggle upward for an idea that's old and whose validity is confirmed in advance, but instead as a kind of big competition between rival ideologies. And our question is then, why are we left at the end of the story with human rights as the thing in which we invest our hopes, in the name of which we might professionalize as international lawyers and try to advance in our own way? So that's basically how I want to proceed. And I've been led to the conclusion in thinking about human rights in this way that human rights really only become a widespread cause and a moving one for both a broad public and American international lawyers in the mid-1970s. They weren't the sole idealism that inspired people in the course of either human events or modern history. And they emerged historically not because they were utopian or promised a better world, because lots of ideologies do that. Instead, they became to be attractive, in the words of the title of this book with which I'm coming out, because they were, in a sense, the last utopia. They emerged powerfully in the 1970s because that was an era in which other things were collapsing. Other utopias that had won out so far were losing their plausibility as ideas that could draw our support and meaningfully better people around the world. You could put it differently. They succeed because they avoided the failure that beset other powerful ideologies, whether those ideologies involve the nation state or other kinds of internationalisms. And here you might think of lots of subaltern internationalisms, like, say, Pan-Africanism would be an example, or communism, most obviously, which was just as internationalist as human rights, but pointed in a very different direction. It emerged then, human rights, as, I think, an alternative to bankrupt political utopias. And that's how we should think at least of its moment of breakthrough in the 1970s. Now, let me pursue my model by laying out 3 stages in the history of human rights. And for this to be intelligible, you'll have to look at my chart, which I hope at least some of you have. It lays out a kind of story of the public prominence or salience of human rights as measured by its citation in newspapers. When did it begin to appear in Anglo-American news, since that's what the chart shows over time? And the key points is that it's a flat line until basically the 40s, when there's a bit of a blip. But then, and this is what's left out of all histories of human rights that I know about, there's something that happens in the 70s, and that's really the kind of moment that creates us. And that's what I want to talk about. So let me go through my 3 stages, if you will. And if I have time, I'll then come back and talk about American international lawyers and their relationship to these stages. So let me start. I mean, a lot of you must be confused before my first stage, because, of course, the idea of rights is really old. all legal systems, including the Roman legal system, provide rights. And later, there are things like rights that inhere in nature, what French revolutionaries called the rights of man. And you might ask, well, isn't that the real origin of human rights? And indeed, the most famous book in this field by Lynn Hunt is called Inventing Human Rights. And it's about the era of the American and French revolutions. So what do we say about this period? Well, I think it's quite misleading, basically, to see that old history as the immediate source of the contemporary understanding of human rights. Now, actually, people try to push the story much further back to think about Greeks, Jews, Christians, and many others. But clearly, with the creation of the idea of the rights of man, of Anglo-American and then French Revolution, we do have something that sounds a lot like human rights. But here's the thing. Rights from their origin as natural rights with thinkers like Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and then in the revolutionary era, were about the construction of the state. If you claimed rights, it was outside legal systems, at least, because you argued that your state had failed to protect your rights. And because of those natural rights, you had permission from nature to replace your state with a new one. That used to be called a revolution. And we did that in this country. And of course, in different ways, the French, who really are those who began speaking about the rights of man, did. And so you could put this another way. Rights in their early versions were about the construction of citizenship spaces, which were necessarily bounded. Now, that seems to me very different from the sense that human rights now has. Now, the rights of man may have involved an appeal to nature, like Jefferson, nature and nature's God. But they didn't involve an appeal to any kind of robust international law. In fact, the idea of the international wasn't even available at the time of the American Revolution. And in terms of their political outcome, rights were about creating sovereignty. And that would be the crucial point to take away. It was always bounded, and it always involved exclusion. So, as I like to put it, to try to be most provocative about it, before there was a human rights movement, there was a rights of man movement. And it was powerful in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th and even in the 20th century. But its chief form was liberal nationalism. That is to say, people living under empire who, just like the Americans did, wanted their own state, a state that coincided with their national peoplehood. Now, let me, just to reinforce this point one last time, cite you a passage from a contemporary philosopher who I think makes the point about the distinction between the rights of man and human rights, which might seem to be just, wordplay, actually very important. The rights of man, he says, that once made sense as the presupposition of the rights of the citizen are now progressively separated from and used outside the context of citizenship for the sake of the representation and protection of life that's more and more driven to the margins of the nation state. If you remember Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, this is basically her idea, but he's taken it. You might put it most challengingly like this. Rights were once the first prerogative of citizens, but in our contemporary forms of internationalism, they're the last chance of humans to whom we can't extend citizenship or who don't have it on their own. Now, even if you want to claim that this distinction is not as great as I'm presenting, it still seems worth reckoning with. If we think about human rights, we typically think about the suffering of other people, typically in the third world, which was never the primary location of talk about the rights of man. And even if there's some continuity, there's some major discontinuity which has to be reckoned with. So it's not on my chart that people hadn't yet discovered our words. They hadn't really stumbled on our project yet. And that's what I want to emphasize. So how did we come to it? Well, leaving ancient history aside, the first stage clearly has to be the 1940s. After all, there is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights then. How do we think about the 1940s? It gets the lion's share of attention. And if you'll permit my religious church history analogy to continue, it's always treated as the moment of Annunciation. And it is the moment when the phrase human rights enters the English language. And it is terrifically important. Now let me turn a bit skeptical for a bit. This typical story that's set on the idea that the 40s are a moment of breakthrough, which would begin already in 1941, before the Americans enter the war with the Atlantic Charter. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a document that FDR and Churchill produce to say, what is this war about, even though the Americans can't be driven into it until they're bombed. And they say it's about 4 freedoms: the freedoms of speech and religion, and the freedom from want, and freedom from fear, which people tend to think the last means something like a secure world in which war doesn't continuously crop up. That's seen as the point of origin, although at that point, human rights have not entered high politics. It's not, that phrase has to wait until 1942. Somehow, there's a line traced from that Atlantic Charter through the 1948 Universal Declaration. Now, I want to suggest that we look more closely at the 40s, and instead of seeing them just as simple enunciation, look more carefully at a kind of 2 big stages in the history of the human rights idea. Now, what does it really mean in these early forms? Because as of 42, FDR does start to talk about it as part of a list. And it's true that American international lawyers do start to get excited about it. And they do things like draft potential lists for an international Bill of Rights in 42 and 3. What do we say about those human rights? I think the first thing to say is that they mean something different for most people. Most people understand them to signify that the war is about the creation of social democracy. If you ask people, what are we fighting for? It's against Nazi tyranny, though not the Holocaust. But it's a new order vision. It's what we're fighting for is something positive and will involve some sort of social democracy. The Brits say that. Even FDR, as famously in 1944, gives a State of the Union address in which he announces a second Bill of Rights, which would cover social and economic rights. There's not much implication, actually, if you survey uses in the 40s, that they have an internationalist bearing. True, they define a kind of outcome for all civilized states, but it's fairly clear that it's still going to be the state that's the forum of right, just as before. And actually, FDR has to be pushed in the direction of having international organization, what eventually becomes the United Nations. So it's not obvious, even though international lawyers start to get excited briefly about the idea of human rights, that it involves a kind of drive towards international law or international legal protection. Instead, the dominant meaning in those first couple of years is at home. Now, even worse, we have to see what the relationship of the Atlantic Charter is to the big world. I've been talking about an Anglo-American idea, but if you look out at the world, the Atlantic Charter is actually extremely exciting around the world, but it's not because it promises social democracy. Instead, it promises the self-determination of peoples, a collective principle that had been introduced back in the day by Lenin and Wilson. Interestingly, there's a dispute over what that phrase means at the Atlantic Charter. Immediately, there's vast enthusiasm around the world, and that's for sure about the Atlantic Charter because of this self-determination principle. It seems to mean that empire is out. But Churchill doesn't see it that way. The Atlantic Charter is about Hitler's empire, not his empire, and it's not about empire in general. And he actually succeeds in convincing FDR of this fact by the end of the day of FDR's life. And so in a sense, if we look carefully, we see that self-determination and human rights are in a kind of hydraulic relationship. Human rights for most of the world turns out to be a kind of consolation prize. What they're not getting is self-determination, and human rights is given instead. In part because the major powers don't see human rights having any implications for the end of empire. That's quite important. As late as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, self-determination is not in the idea of human rights. And I think when we look and do a differential history around the world, it shouldn't be surprising that there's such enthusiasm about the Atlantic Charter and almost none about the Universal Declaration outside the North Atlantic zone. And I think that should be sobering. But even at home, there's a story to tell, not about the realization of human rights in the Universal Declaration, but about their scuttling. And I don't want to get into too much detail given the rapidly advancing time, but the story would go roughly like this. There's lots of idealistic talk once FDR is brought around to the idea of international organization about what it will involve. Maybe it will involve human rights. But as of 1944, when the first drafts are announced, or leaked actually, in the so-called Dumbarton-Oaks agreements, it's very clear that whatever the idealism of rhetoric, the UN is going to be a great power agreement. Lots of states may be included, but its governance, its core, its security is going to be provided by the wartime alliance, which is essentially going to be embedded in the organization as its heart and as its center of power, which of course is still with us. Now, what happens to human rights? Fascinatingly, they're almost unmentioned, just like self-determination in the Dumbarton drafts. This is a great scandal, especially the absence of self-determination. And it's true that human rights return the next year at San Francisco. They come back. They're come back, first of all, in the preamble, right, of the UN Charter, which, as I mentioned at dinner last night, is drafted by a South African, Jan Christian Smuts, who's actually also the founder of apartheid, and doesn't understand this noble rhetoric to have any implications for, just for instance, race relations in his own country. And there's also the articles then in the UN Charter which call for according human rights as a problem to the Economic and Social Council, which leads to the creation of the Human Rights Commission. However, I think it's widely understood by this point, and not least by international lawyers, that the path after Dumbarton is one of ornamentalizing, prettifying what is a great power settlement based on realism. Okay? Now, that's quite controversial, I think, in the history of human rights, which, for example, if you read Elizabeth Borgward's book, A New Deal for the World, presents America as bringing human rights to the world. But actually, if we take on board this hydraulic relationship between self-determination and human rights on the one hand, and the ornamental, quite literally, status of human rights in the UN Charter on the other, seems hard to sustain. Then decolonization happens. That's my second stage, and I want to talk about that briefly. Because quite unexpectedly, after the 40s, when human rights are basically stillborn, and if they mean anything, they mean a stillborn UN project. No human rights movement is born in the 40s. That's quite significant. The UN then is a place where decolonization has a major impact. Unexpected at first, but eventually, at least in the General Assembly, quite transformative. Well, what happens to human rights this minor UN idea because of decolonization. For reasons I've explained, they're not used as a major slogan in anti-colonialism around the world in the actual struggle against empire. After all, those people were used to Western universalisms as being the old excuse for colonialism. And in more recent memory, they knew that human rights had been added on condition of self-determination falling out of the picture. Well, the new states, first with assistance from the Soviet Union and then quite on their own, inject self-determination into the human rights idea. And as a fossil of that, you can look at the two covenants which eventually emerge in 1966. The first of all human rights is collective self-determination. I may not have time to get to this, but this is the chief reason why American international lawyers, who first dropped human rights after the mid-40s because they saw the writing on the wall in Dumbarton, then take further distance throughout the post-war period. It's not just that human rights seem meaningless because of the Cold War, although they do, but in a sense, because of what they see as the capture of human rights by anti-colonialist forces, in which they've been, in a sense, sacrificed on the altar of collective self-determination. They're not a cause that excites them. And certainly, they're not a cause that leads to much of a social movement, if anything. Okay, well then, I want to talk then about the 1970s. Why then? If the 1940s lead to their stymieing, don't give rise to a movement, although this will be more controversial, don't lead to their embedding in international legal projects. What happens in the 70s? Or why do they become so glamorous, uplifting, and worth committing to, including for international lawyers? Well, let me suggest there was a negative aspect and a positive aspect. And here I'm going to focus just on America, since that's where we are. Well, the negative aspect would be the decline of anti-colonialism as a world historical force, dominant at the UN, where in the 70s it's trying to do things like create a new international economic order, things that have been more or less forgotten. But in the metropolitan places like the United States, people have lost interest in anti-colonialism and the pursuit of rights, if at all, within the framework of new nation states around the world. That's a project that doesn't seem to have worked out. I mean, just to put it very bluntly. And because of this decline of anti-colonialism as a kind of exciting new feature of the post-war world, if people like it, you could say that rights start to mean something new that they hadn't before, or could mean something new. Might say that they lost their world historical associations with revolutionary nationalism. Now, if you buy my big story, if you remember, rights are defined from the beginning by the search for revolution and the nation state. And after all, that's all people involved in decolonization want. They want the nation state, just like Americans and Frenchmen had sought rights through the achievement of the nation state. That's what they were doing. Now, in the West, we tend to realize in the 1970s that they failed badly. Maybe we succeeded for whatever reasons, but rights could not be pursued, at least by them, in the framework of the revolutionary construction of the nation state. And if you look around the 70s in political rhetoric, and especially in the mid-70s when human rights become a new idea in the United States, you find this as a kind of central component of human rights consciousness breaking through. Let me cite from Arthur Schlesinger Jr., famous American historian. He's writing in 1977, reflecting on that moment. And he says, human rights are crucial because we need to leave self-determination behind. Sure, we introduced it to the world. what does America stand for in world history? What's the idea that is America, to cite the title of a recent book by Anne-Marie Slaughter? Well, until recently, it was post-colonial nationalism. But that changes in the 70s. He says, states may meet all the criteria of national self-determination and still be blots on the planet. Human rights is the way of reaching the deeper principle, which is individual self-determination. So in this moment when the bloom is off the rose of anti-colonial nationalism, somehow something called individual self-determination will be a kind of alternative. More interestingly even is Daniel Patrick Moynihan writing the same year and reflecting on the domestic events in the United States that have led human rights to be so exciting. And he says the following: "The tremendous investment of hope in what we saw as the small seedlings of our various great oaks, and a corresponding reluctance to think, much less speak, ill of them, led us to once champion anti-colonialism." But he continues, "Then there was the trauma of Vietnam, which perhaps made it seem even more necessary that we should be approved by the nations very like the one we were despoiling." So this is a moment, and again, it seems really quite crucial that human rights arise so prominently in America just a couple of years after America leaves Vietnam, that the insight is one that we've just waited too long for the third world to realize its promise. We can't give them a pass anymore. And if we'd wanted to criticize them before, we would have been hypocrites given our involvement in Vietnam, but that's over. So he explicitly makes these two claims in 1977 in this breakthrough year for human rights. In a larger sense, the 1970s are the era in which formal imperialism ends in world history, a few islands aside. Okay, so that would be a negative aspect. What if the waning of anti-colonialism and the search for the nation state as the framework for rights, in a sense, loses its glamour or becomes implausible? Well, what would the positive aspect be? The argument I want to make in the last few minutes is that human rights break through in this era because they seem like a plausible utopia when others were dying. Now, if we look at the whole post-war period, we ask, why didn't human rights continue as a powerful idea, at least in the developed West? The typical answer is the Cold War. But of course, the 1970s are also part of the Cold War. So I think we need to think more carefully about what is it about the early Cold War that leads to human rights being so marginal as an idea, but somehow in the 70s leads them to seem like a kind of new solution for those of us seeking an ideal. Well, I think the large-scale story would look like this. By the 70s, indeed by the 60s, the terms of the Cold War, which were very absorbing in the late 40s and throughout the 1950s, become unconvincing to large swaths of the population. 1968, which is a kind of global disruption in both the capitalist and communist worlds, show this. And in fact, one historian even claims that after 1968, leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain start to make common cause because they realize that the terms of their Cold War confrontation are not absorbing the populace anymore, and they need to find some way of cooling off hostilities. And that's his argument for the origins of détente. But of course, 1968 doesn't give us human rights. If you look at the chart, they're delayed by a really long time. What happens? Why 1977? Well, I've suggested in a kind of vague way that the Vietnam Wars ended, more generally anti-colonialism's ended. But if we look at the developed West after 1968, of course, there are lots of responses. Cold War frameworks may have become unexciting, but people propose lots of different responses. There's a big rivalry, and I think this is the best way to think about the 70s. on the ground is a kind of big rivalry about which global idea could best improve the world. And human rights survived that debate, certainly in this country. Now, 1977 is quite important for a few reasons. The first is that Amnesty International wins the Nobel Prize. Now, Amnesty had emerged even earlier, of course, but it had almost dissolved as late as the late 60s because of its infiltration by British intelligence. More generally, it remained quite restricted in its size up through the early 70s. Its American story is one of creation almost from nothing until in the 70s, when it begins to, let's say, grow as a result of the huge expansion of all sorts of social movements. So the first key aspect, I think, is that it's only in the 1970s that human rights acquired a grassroots social movement backing that it hadn't had before. Second, politicians, again for the first time, began to affiliate with it. Now, FDR, as I mentioned, had used the term human rights on a list of other things. But in his inaugural address, January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter, and it was shocking at the time, says, just as in a way Patrick Moynihan might suggest, we've gone through Vietnam, we've had Henry Kissinger. He wasn't the only problem, because after all, it was liberals like me who initiated and escalated the Vietnam War. We now need to turn the page. We can't fight fire with fire. And I want America to stand for human rights. And it's clear that along with the new social movement energy, Carter, who touches off a simply massive debate in the first 3 months of 1977 over what human rights are. They weren't particularly embedded in the English language at that point. Is really responsible for that moment of discontinuity. Now, of course, that story, and let me conclude, doesn't explain why they stay around. I think the larger case would have to turn on what the alternatives are. The Cold War, of course, remains going for a while. And in a sense, human rights only have their true opening after 1989. I haven't had time to speak about this crucial period between the 70s and the end of the Cold War. But if we think about what candidates there are for our investment and excitement, it seems to me that, especially on the left, our main story would have to be one of the failure of other things. And that might be one chief reason why at least human rights have an opening. Now, I feel terrible because I haven't had time to address American international lawyers, but let me just mention that we have to have the big picture of these three stages to understand their particular itinerary. After this 1940s moment during the war, they're among the first to drop human rights as having any prospective doctrinal centrality. The story of the path to the Universal Declaration is not a story in which American international lawyers, or really European international lawyers, are deeply involved. And the reason is because they've read the Dumbarton-Oaks agreements. They know the writing on the wall. And while they hope to continue their old campaign of using formalism to bring harmony to world affairs, the content of the form after this early 40s moment is not yet human rights, even before the Cold War crystallizes. And then anti-colonialism captures human rights. And this they treat as a kind of affront. And this would include people who are going to become the chief partisans in law schools of human rights. I just mentioned one name from my own university, Louis Henkin, who's often treated as the grandfather of human rights, and he was there from the beginning. It's just that the beginning was the 70s. In an earlier era, he had cast cold water on the UN and its human rights program as a possible agent of political reform, and he had denounced bitterly the rise of self-determination as the master principle. So I would propose that part of the centralization of human rights for American international lawyers is about the ability in the 70s to reclaim human rights from anti-colonialism. Now, of course, there are other reasons. But if we look out across the landscape of American international law, with a very few exceptions, we find the 70s is a discontinuous moment. The first courses in human rights, with one exception, are taught in the 70s at Columbia and Harvard. The first casebook is published in the 70s. Just if you want a kind of a barometer of change, some students in 1968 form a journal just like you do. They call this the Columbia Survey of Human Rights Law, but it's about domestic civil rights. Fascinatingly, at this late date, human rights doesn't mean global law, global concerns. But shortly, of course, because of the casebooks, the courses, and lots of doctrinal work, this becomes a crucial concern. So my suggestion is that we would need to get clear on these stages, even to understand the trajectory of American international lawyers. The story is emphatically not one of them guarding or chasing the flame. International law, I believe, is far more of a lag variable. And it's also, in a sense, just as the school of a constitutional thought originating from Yale called democratic constitutionalism suggests, international lawyers in their turn to human rights are dependent on this social movement energy. They hadn't come to it in the 40s as the essence of their discipline. Only as a result of events outside and especially below the elite level at which they work did they turn to it. So that kind of story, I think, is going to be necessary to explain how it is that, as one law professor puts it, at the dawn of the new century, international law has been reconceived, no longer the law of nation states, it's the law of human rights. So my suggestion here is that that happened incredibly recently and is part of a history we should not romanticize, but look more carefully at in order to get clear about why it is that we believe what we believe. So.